Avoiding ethical issues in a remote work environment. So again, I'm Perry. I'm one of the accounting professors at Lipscomb, getting ready to start my 39th year at Lipscomb. I don't know if Kevin had that many years at Deloitte.
Just about 38 or so.
And recently, in one of the Twitter accounts I follow, this came from the NASBA Center for the Public Trust through Alfonso Alexander, who leads that. And I thought it was an interesting slide about misconduct, which to some extent is really what we're talking about today. Kevin, when you see this, what do you think about?
You know, I think of many of the discussions and panels that I've either observed or participated in that talk about motivation for ethical misconduct, or some might shortcut that to say fraud, since that's the kind of the prevalent word in our literature. And in particular, Perry, I think of one of the more memorable lectures that I've heard on it, and it was this presentation on a bell curve. And basically the presenter was saying that, you know, there's a certain percentage of people in the population that are prone to commit fraud, or if you will, ethical misconduct, almost at the drop of a hat. I mean, they don't need any incentive. They don't need any, trigger. They just are that way. Hopefully that's a small percentage. And then on the other hand, he pointed out in his lecture that there is a certain small percentage of folks that would be honest even if you threaten them with torture and death. And then in between, his view was that, you know, most folks are generally more opportunistic. So if they are threatened, or if the temptation is great and the opportunity permits, they might slide a little bit more to the scale where they would commit fraud or ethical misconduct, or they may not if they perceive that the deterrents are there, and that there's a high likelihood of getting caught and adverse consequences resulting from that. And so, you know, that's one of the things that I think about. That particular lecture has stood with me. And I think there's probably some, support for some of that. I'm not sure if it was as cut and dried as he viewed it. But I do think that clearly we have folks that commit fraud, and we have folks that would never do it, and we've got folks that probably are in between and might do it if the opportunity and circumstances permit it.
It's funny how stories stick with you. I had a similar story, it's now been 30 years ago, from an individual who was the regional manager for a local fast food chain. And he said their studies showed, of their employees, mind you, of their employees, 25% were actively stealing at that moment. 25% would never steal. The other 50% were thinking about it.
Yeah.
And he said, he told the story. He said, yesterday I was in one of our stores and they didn't know me. And I gave them cash to pay for the meal. And he said, there was something where either he forgot his change and they rushed out to give him his change. And he said, that must be one of the honest ones.
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting environment, particularly now we're in a COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of the work, particularly for public companies and for audit firms, public accounting firms, people are working remotely from their home. And that really kind of gets to the topic of today's session, which is basically, you know, in a remote workplace environment, what's going to happen with respect to ethical misconduct. And maybe this is time for our first polling question. We'll have 5 or 6 polling questions throughout this session, and the first question is going to pop up shortly, and it's really asking your input as to whether you think moving to that largely remote work environment is going to lead to increased workplace ethical misconduct, or decreased workplace ethical misconduct, or not really a significant change. So it'd be interesting to get your viewpoints on that, if you can go ahead and respond to that polling question.
While they're voting, Kevin, let's look at the bottom of this slide, the orange part. We both are seasoned. And if you think about what the studies show about pressure. Pressure that management or others place on an employee to meet the company goals no matter what. And sometimes that's driven by bad compensation systems or outsized rewards. I'm almost surprised to some extent some of these numbers aren't higher.
I don't disagree, Perry. I mean, I didn't really believe it when I started in my professional career, but there are a lot of dimensions to the adage, you get what you pay for. And as I've come to see that throughout my career, particularly in the design of compensation systems for senior executives and the incentives and or disincentives that are created, you know, you can find a lot of interesting behavior as a result of that. And the example that I would use is just for any of you who are fans of the television series Survivor, you know, just look at what, you know, a couple of dozen folks will do to try to have 1 in, you know, 24 chance of winning $1 million. Now there's a little bit more to it than that. I guess there's fame apart from winning for those that don't win. But I mean, people just do interesting things, and compensation is a pretty strong motivator in many of those interesting things, at least as we see it in the public accounting and corporate management realm.
If you want to, okay, here's our results, Kevin. I'll let you talk about it.
Okay, so it doesn't look like our participants think that we're going to have a decrease in ethical misconduct, and we'll explore that in a minute or two. It looks like the majority answer is not really a significant change one way or the other. But for those that think there will be a change one way or the other, it's all pointing toward increased ethical misconduct. And that's, you know, I guess I wouldn't necessarily have been surprised by that response. I personally would not look to see a decrease for a variety of reasons. You know, to me, one of the things is, you know, human beings by their nature are social. You know, we typically, you know, have gone by this adage that no man or woman is an island unto him or herself. And I have been concerned about, you know, what's going to happen, you know, from an auditor perspective, which is where I spent my career, you know, what's going to happen in terms of the internal control structures and the processes and procedures for folks relative to fraud and ethical misconduct at the companies that we audit, now that their employees may be largely working remotely. And, you know, you have automated systems and more dependence upon them perhaps, but I'll just give one example. You know, we are required as auditors to sit down, at least for those of us that are, you know, working on audits of public companies, but also even under the AICPA auditing standards, board standards. You know, we have responsibilities with respect to the detection of material misstatements where they're caused by error or fraud. And, you know, one of the specific tasks that we would typically do in a public company audit is we would interview key individuals in management and including C-suite executives and audit committee members with respect to certain matters surrounding fraud and procedures that are in place. And I know that for me, every time I conduct an interview, and I've had training, we actually had at our firm, my former firm, former interview specialists, shall we say, that were formerly with the CIA, that actually taught training courses on how to conduct an interview and how to try to detect what they would call tells, if you will, of fraud or deception. And, you know, it's one thing to do that when you're face to face in a room and can more closely observe tone and tenor. It's a lot more difficult, in my opinion, to do that when you're remote, either on a phone call or even on a Zoom call, to try to kind of ferret that out. And so I think some of the tools that we have in the toolbox are going to be harder to employ, Perry.
Agreed. And a lot of this just goes back to the tone at the top. I mean, if you want to read an interesting story, hunt up the autobiography that Carly Fiorna wrote years ago. Now, I know she ran for Senate and ran for president, but this was written shortly after her tenure at Hewlett Packard ended. And that was a company that we studied in corporate governance because of some governance failures there. But she told the story once when I think she was at Lucent, and that's where she was recruited from to go to Hewlett Packard. And she said, one time I had to go down to South America to basically show the flag. So she was invited to a dinner where several senior ministers of the Brazilian government were there. And she said this dinner just kept going on and on and on. And she said she finally clued in, they want to know if we'll pay to play. So she said, I tried to quickly excuse myself, went to wherever she was staying, and the next morning met with whoever was in charge of the area. He said, well, that's just how we do business here. And I can structure it so that you'll never know about it and it will never appear. Yeah. But when she got back, she had him fired. And to me, the more telling, she lowered their guidance. She had management lower their guidance because she said, if this is what we have to do to make money, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Well, that sends signals.
It absolutely does. And tone at the top is just critical, or the absence of tone at the top is equally, if not more critical. And, you know, I think this might be a good time for our second polling question, which relates to whether or not you, in your businesses, have actually observed significant changes in the control environment as a result to moving to a remote work environment. You know, it looked like in response to the first polling question, you know, folks are expecting not, you know, some potential slight increase, at least no decrease in ethical misconduct as a result of that. And so I think it's a fair question to ask if entities are actually changing their internal control environment to respond to this.
Kevin, I've got an interesting story there from one of our alums. He says one of our current internal controls is a dual signature on checks over $5,000. As we shifted to working from home, we moved a lot of our vendors, like most other companies, to an EFT payment. Obviously, that eliminated the need for a second signature. As we reviewed the process, it became evident that while we can still have a second approval over $5,000, that would not stop a person from changing the account number in the electronic file that is submitted to the bank after it was approved. Unlike a signed check, that change would be easy, and the bank, in their case, would not be looking at the account numbers. In fact, he said, we don't even send the bank the vendors. Yeah. He said, we're making some changes to our internal controls, but the loss of the internal control was an unintended consequence. And we're looking at other controls to see if there's other ones that need to be changed.
You know, I think there's a lot going on out there along those lines. And it's funny that you mentioned the dual signature requirement. You know, I actually, one of my former partners actually was a participant in this fraud story, not as the fraudster, but effectively what he was doing, he was teaching a night course on auditing, and it was in the New York City area, and a lot of the participants in his auditing class worked at financial institutions, broker-dealers, and banks. And he was talking about the dual signature control and what that really represented. And he could see that one of his participants was getting more and more uncomfortable. And so finally the night class was over, and she came up to him and said, can we chat for a few moments? And he said, well, yeah, it is pretty late, but sure, we can. And she explained that she was you know, an assistant vice president at a bank branch who was one of those dual signers on cashier's checks that the bank would issue. And she had finally grasped the reason why dual signatures might function as a legitimate, you know, viable control with respect to disbursements in that partner's lecture at that class that night. And she said, now that I understand why, you know, that is, I'm concerned because my supervisor has been having me pre-sign cashier's checks with my signature so that if I'm out to lunch or something, the bank branch can still issue cashier's checks to customers as needed. And so no surprise that this partner is really an experienced, sharp guy. And he said, well, does your bank have an internal audit department? And she said, yes. And she said, what you need to do, he told her, first thing in the morning, contact your internal audit department and tell them what you just told me. And she did that. And by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, federal authorities were at the bank and arrests were being made of her supervisor. And the only reason she did not get arrested was because she was the one who belatedly, realized the value of that control and blew the whistle when she realized, because of her signature requests in the past were not really functioning as a control, something needed to be done.
Well, here's our poll results.
Okay. So it looks like about 2/3 haven't had or seen significant changes yet, and just slightly over 1/3 have.
But we both know what may drive some of that is the fraud triangle.
Yeah.
I mean, this came out of the fraud literature, but now it's part of GAS. And we all know, but I've looked at the participants, but not all of them are accountants. But there's 3 corners to this triangle: pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. A case we always look at in our undergraduate auditing course is the Goodner Brothers case. This was an entity that for the most part sold tires, the big black tires that go on vehicles. So there were 2 best friends, grew up, played together, went to school together, were in each other's weddings. One of them went to work for his father-in-law, who owned an auto repair shop. He got his best friend a job in a local wholesale distributor. This friend had a gambling problem. And when he started work, he passed a background check, but over time he maxed out several credit cards, was burning banks, apparently was in hock to a local bookie. And one day the local bookie threatened his wife. Pressure.
Yeah.
He'd already seen the opportunity. This entity had no controls. There were no formal documentation requirements. All of the salespeople were allowed to enter transactions into the accounting system. The district manager over the office also had a sales territory, which meant he wasn't inclined to look closely at what was going on. Numerous customers began to complain, and he just handed the complaint over to the salesman. So lousy control, so there's the opportunity. Yeah. His rationalization, I don't want my wife to get hurt. And in 18 months, he stole $180,000 in tires. Tires. Again, fraud triangle. The opportunity had been there, but he had a gambling problem, he was for the most part honest. But when the right pressure was put on him, he could rationalize a difference in behavior. And I think that may be what we're in right now with this COVID crisis.
Well, I think that's right, Perry, and I think it's interesting. I looked through the what I'll call the COVID-19 alerts that both the SEC and the PCAOB have put out in the last, I guess now 6 months, almost approaching 6 months. And what they're asking folks to focus on. SEC alerts are primarily directed toward preparers or public company management, and the PCAOB alerts are primarily, of course, directed toward public company auditors. But there is some overlap there, and those alerts are talking about things like re-emphasizing segregation of duties. It's just amazing what can happen when you don't have segregation of duties, and that's probably why my hair is white as an auditor because, you know, I worry not about the fraud that we've detected as much as I worry about the frauds that we didn't detect or that are currently going on to this day that were never detected by anyone. And, you know, I think it raises an interesting question in terms of, you know, what does the perpetrator of the ethical misconduct or the fraud, if you will, in a financial reporting standpoint context, think? You know, there's maybe the motivation or the pressure. That's the part of the triangle that was being thought about and applied in your example. The other side of that, though, is the fear of being caught in terms of doing that. And the audit function may provide some element of deterrence there. Certainly, compliance processes and procedures that companies employ may provide another element of that. And the fact of the matter is, external auditors generally are not the initial detectors of most frauds. And in fact, a lot of frauds that are initially detected are detected because someone decided to blow the whistle when they became aware of the fraud being perpetrated. You know, and I'll never forget, this was a formative example in my early part of my career. I used to audit out of our Omaha, Nebraska practice office, and they changed the law that allowed public auditing firms to audit counties, you know, county municipal forms of government in Nebraska. Prior to that, they'd been audited by the state auditor's office every once in a blue moon, you know, depending on the rotation. And so, you know, we had to teach these county treasurers what a bank confirmation was, because some of them had never even seen that. And, you know, we got through that. And interestingly, the one county that we were selected on as the first public company accounting auditor for insisted as a part of their contract that the auditors come in and do surprise cash counts. You know, that's not necessarily a procedure that is required by GAS, but in this case, they insisted that that be done, and we agreed to that procedure, and we performed it, and we never found any untoward types of items. Well, fast forward to 3 or 4 years after we were no longer auditing that county, they had dropped that procedure in their contractual arrangements with the successor auditor. They were not being performed, and lo and behold, the county treasurer, who had been in that position for 35 years, and it was a publicly elected position, she was about 68 years old, was arrested one day for basically tapping the treasurer till. And as it turned out, she had a gambling and a prescription drug problem. And it wasn't the auditor that caught that. It was her deputy treasurer who turned her in when she became aware of the fraud being perpetrated. And, you know, it was interesting. She was 68 years old when this was caught, and she was sentenced to 35 years in prison. But one of the things that came out in the trial was that when the cash count requirement was ongoing and she knew that there could be a surprise cash count, that was enough of a deterrent to prevent her from doing what she later did. And when she figured out that process was no longer in place, she lost that deterrent, and then the pressure side of the triangle, Perry, kicked in, and there it went.
Here's another story from an alum who said, in a good way, several of their processes still required a physical presence, even after COVID-19. Their payments were made via check generated by the controller and required 2 physical signatures, one from an officer outside of accounting and one from the CFO. New processes were needed to make the payments electronically, which required our company to think through new controls. And then he made another interesting point. He said security is a concern, and I've heard this has begun to rise in the COVID environment. He said 2 different times prior to the pandemic, an IT hacker spoofed his email and changed our company's direct deposit instructions with a client. Poor internal controls from the client resulted in over 3 million being sent to the wrong bank account. The client did not call to verify the banking information. He said, luckily the money was able to be retrieved, but it was a good lesson in strong controls to always verify payment information received electronically. And I've seen stuff this week. These types of frauds are up.
They are up, and they are increasingly sophisticated, to the point where it's not like the old, situation where you get an email from somebody from Africa saying send money that's got typos and misspellings and everything else. These things are incredibly well done and can be very complicated. And I think that kind of gets back to the issue of, in terms of ethical misconduct in the workplace, that may have originated from someone outside of the workplace that was perpetrated on one of their clients. But I guess, it might be good for another polling question, that what are the types of concerns inside the workplace from an ethical misconduct perspective? So if you're concerned that there may be increased risks, do any of these categories stand out to you? Employees misreporting their time, less effectiveness in supervising or training, just greater general risk due to more, or I should say less connectedness, or other. Because I think all of those and a host of others are potentially on concern on the part of companies and employees as well.
And I'll have a story on that once the poll results are in.
One thing while we're waiting period for the poll results, I did a little survey in terms of kind of the warning messages that the forensics people in my former firm at Deloitte are kind of putting out. And, they're basically, this is just a list of 7, that's kind of the hot list of manipulations here. But they include, margin manipulation, restructurings and big bath charges, capitalization of expenses that should not be capitalized, disclosure fraud, pressure arising from stock drop litigation. And those are just a few of the types of items, that are out there. And, it's not easy to kind of wade through all of that and to kind of keep everything going, either from an auditor perspective, but particularly from a management perspective.
Here's what one alum said. And this is what gets in that. She said, I love remote work and working with remote workers. But early on, I had to determine what I was going to supervise. And that's what this slide is getting at. Hours or outcomes. With remote workers, I can't know for sure how long they're working. It's much easier to track accessibility, responsiveness, and outcomes, so that's what I do. She said she's got one remote worker who does her best work from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So I load her up during the day. She works through the middle of the night, and I pick up the results in the morning. It works well. But I have another remote worker who does project work for me. I get it ready. She picks it up and delivers it 2 weeks later by the deadline. I don't monitor how long it takes her. Even though I pay her by the hour, I'm at risk of being taken advantage of, but the amount I end up paying her, I'm willing to pay for the job if she delivers. So to me, it's less about what does she put in and more about what is the project worth to me.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting way of looking at it. And it looked like from the poll results, I think the majority of those respondents, the greatest category was folks feeling less connected or less invested. I think that's an interesting kind of concept. And the way I look at it, particularly for folks that are newly employed by a company and haven't had a chance to kind of be steeped in that company's culture and practices and procedures and the way they do business, and that can also apply to a public accounting firm that's performing audits. On-the-job training is probably the most important training that a person is going to get in their first several years as an auditor. And that's a lot harder to do in this kind of a remote environment where you're not a member of a team. You are, but you may not feel as connected to that team, connecting via Zoom as we're trying to do today, as you otherwise would have by being, in close proximity to one another.
Davis, put the poll results back up. if you can. Kevin, here's what a public accountant raised. Do you write down an invoice when you know your staff has not been trained or supervised as well when they are in the office as opposed to working remotely where it's harder to monitor them? You know staff took longer than necessary on some work because of the remote conditions, but you didn't reduce the invoice. It's not everyone's fault that they're working remotely. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, you have, again, it kind of gets back to me to be the hours worked part of the equation. You know, are we paying for someone's time, or are we paying for either a service or a product delivery? And you know, there have been, for time immemorial, there have been arguments about, you know, what I'll call value billing versus time and expense billing. And what does that mean? And I think what I'm seeing in practice is that people are just literally having to negotiate, you know, situation by situation, what's there. There may not be as much staff time doing something, but there may be more input behind the scenes, because auditing firms, for example, have to build the cybersecurity infrastructure to keep their clients' information safe. Whereas before, you know, if they were auditing on site and in person, they didn't necessarily need to do that. And so, you know, there are some expense structures that are basically no longer really part of an hourly time framework, but have to be there in order for, you know, the work to be done and to be done securely and properly. And it's interesting because I think the regulators, the SEC and particularly the PCAOB, who is super sensitive to audit fee discussions, and particularly anyone that would purport to blame the PCAOB for increasing audit fees, you know, they kind of have some skin in the game there too, because the requirements are not diminishing. And quite frankly, in a corporate situation, the fact that people are working remotely, assuming they can continue to do their jobs, those requirements aren't diminishing. That pressure side of the triangle is not lessening in many cases, and it may even be increasing.
Let's do another poll question. You know, when I graduated in 1981, that dates me, Axel Swang said, Perry, you might face an ethical dilemma. Today, I tell my students, you will face multiple ethical dilemmas in your accounting career. I don't know, I can't give a good reason why things are different beyond just, I think business is more complex, there's more technology. In 81, there was not a PC, so it was all mainframes. But I think I hear from more of our students, either while they're in school or after it, and I'll share a story in a minute that came in Monday night from a student whose family business last week was hit with a fraud.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to me, Perry, on that is that there is, I think, greater technological opportunity than there was when we graduated in the early to mid 80s here with respect to perpetrating fraud. And you know, there may also be a greater chance of detection risk as well, given techniques and compliance techniques and internal auditors and the like. But it's clearly out there.
Okay, we have a question, but so 100% have faced an ethical dilemma. That's not surprising. You don't want to say it's sad, because you look at what Lipscomb is founded on, doing business right is the right way to do business. I mean, you're going to face the dilemma. It's what you do when you face the dilemma. Here's our question. What advice would you give to new staff starting this fall in a remote environment? How can firms help protect new staff from burnout in this environment, especially with busy season likely being remote?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't have an easy answer to that, but I would at least provide some thought around that. And that is, what companies and public accounting firms need to do with anyone that they're onboarding in this current time frame in a remote environment is they need to kind of create a safety net around that new person. So I would, what I have seen in our firm is that, we're assigning buddies or mentors, if you will, to young staff. We're having regular check-ins, trying to have safe, socially distanced check-ins where possible, and oftentimes that may not be possible. And people are going to be working in a remote environment, I would expect, right through this traditional busy season that's upcoming. I hope that's not the case, but I believe it will be the case. And the best advice I can give is the more contacts and the better structure of mentoring around those new hires that can be created, the better off they and the company or the accounting firm will be. Because you've got to bring those people into the family and let them know that they're valued, let them know that we are trying to train them, and that auditors at least still have the opportunity to perform appropriate supervision and review. That professional standard has not gone away. It may be harder to perform in some cases under this environment, but it's not gone away. And the PCOB was very quick to remind the profession of that, and appropriately so. But I would say the more connections you can create, even on a remote or a socially distanced basis, the better.
And what's going to be interesting, we're almost coming up on the 20th anniversary of Sarbanes-Oxley, Section 404. And I just wonder, in some cases, I mean, no management wants to get, a control deficiency. But how much of that has just been down pat? I mean, the controls there, we did it years ago and it's kind of parked, and you wonder just how much they look at stuff. Because here's what one person in public accounting said. I have one client who previously did a lot of in-person reviews where items were manually signed off and discussed to validate that something was reviewed. This was not ideal, as management and the firm have to validate that review process, and all we had was the signature on a piece of paper and evidence of some discussions and maybe some supporting documents, but not really proof. In this new environment, he said they've moved to using Adobe Sign to evidence they reviewed something, but also set up Zooms and instituted a new process to ensure there is a formal process for reviewing items, attaching electronic proof, and not just relying on an informal process. I mean, as an auditor, that's what you want. They're taking an old control and making it better.
Yeah, ideally, that's a great response. And I know the PCOB has expressed concerns because in their guidance, their expectation when they inspect an audit engagement set of work papers is they expect active and direct observation and participation, not from a management perspective, but in a walkthrough sense, in observing how whatever the particular procedure that is the subject of the control is being undertaken. And it sounds like in that example, they've actually upgraded. They've used this as an opportunity to upgrade their processes. And the inspections that the PCOB is going to undertake a year from now of audits that are completed for calendar year 2020 are going to be interesting, because there's going to be a lot of difficulty or change, I think, or unsettledness in doing that. The other situation that we have, we have the critical audit matter reporting mandate now. I wonder, how many new critical audit matters we're going to see related to COVID-19 that we didn't see a year ago or the year prior to that in what the walkthroughs that many firms were doing.
And we may begin to see some of that soon for the non-calendar year ends.
We will, and it's going to be fascinating to take a look at that.
Another polling question, Davis. So this wasn't asking the first one, have you been asked really to do something? More now kind of tying into that first slide we had, have you observed an instance of fraud or ethical misconduct? Years ago, I was teaching a night class, And I could tell a female student was distraught. Clearly, something had happened to this young lady that day, because this was a 5:30 to 9:30 class. So I tried to seek her out after class, but she was making a beeline to me, and she said, "Dr. Moore, I'm terrified. I caught my boss today committing $100,000 payroll fraud. I'm a single mom. The company's been unbelievably good to me. I don't want to testify. I don't want to get involved, but I did tell HR." Story went on. Company did the right thing. They did the investigation. The boss was whatever, prosecuted, fired, but they kept her out of it. I said, the key thing is you did the right thing. You observed and you did something about it.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. We really have since baseball season starting today, probably, you know, I'll just harken back to a discussion I had with one of your classes, Perry, and I think we had a Lipscomb baseball team player in that class, and we had some good discussion around that. It's when you look at what the Houston Astros and other teams were accused of doing with respect to sign stealing, you know, it just raises all sorts of questions, because in that situation, there were a lot of folks that were privy to what was going on. And so then we got into a discussion, you know, from an academic cheating standpoint, you know, how many folks, you know, had seen evidence during their high school or collegiate careers, you know, evidence of academic dishonesty or cheating, if you will, by others. And most everyone raised their hand saying, well, yeah, they'd seen or at least had awareness of that. But then when the question comes to, and how many of you are willing to step up and report it, you know, not very many hands went up. And, you know, this is a question that I took from a presentation that Andy Roberts gave. He's a well-known fraud person who speaks a lot on fraudulent matters. And he said it just never fails. I mean, just about everybody raises their hand when they've observed an instance of fraud or dishonesty. But when you ask them the point blank question, are you willing to put your name on the line and do something about it and report it? You know, not very many hands go up often. And I think that's one reason why, you know, there's probably a lot of undetected fraud out there. And it's the other reason why that when fraud is reported, it's generally done by a tipster or a whistleblower rather than caught directly by an external auditor, or in some cases, even an internal audit team.
100% again, not too surprising.
Yeah.
We have a question. How do you create an environment that equips employees to make ethical decisions? Is that something that can be trained?
You know, I think you can do some training around it. Now, we talked initially at the beginning of the hour about this bell curve where you might have some folks that are predisposed to commit unethical behavior with no incentive other than that's their nature. And yet on the other side of the spectrum, you have some that would never do that. And then you have the in-between responding to the pressures, you know, that are going on in the fraud triangle. And I think, you know, one of the keys there is deterrence. And, you know, trying to, you know, you have preventive controls and then you have detective controls. And I think good deterrence includes both of those types. And if someone thinks there's a high likelihood of being caught and of circumstances or outcomes being bad, that's going to deter many, not all, but, you know, most people that have some semblance of sanity, I think, are going to be deterred if they knew there was 100% likelihood of being caught and really bad outcomes there. So, you know, that's one thing you can do is you can set up processes and controls. You can provide training as to what your expectations are relative to ethical behavior. The tone at the top, Perry, that you talked about, I think is very fair and relevant. You know, the other thing that's significant is in the hiring process, being discerning in terms of the types of people you're hiring. I'm not talking about inappropriate profiling or some type of discriminatory behavior, but I mean, most employers are doing background checks. We had a situation that I became aware of in a public company fraud where the entity hired someone to be basically their accounts payable supervisor, did a background check on him. It came back clean. Lo and behold, one day the FBI knocks on the door and says, "We're here to arrest that person." They had flagged him because the banks were reporting suspicious activity in his personal accounts. And as it turned out, he was, due to improper segregation of duties, pulling money out of the company, wiring it to dummy vendors that he had set up. And as it turned out, once they did further investigation, he had been tried and convicted for 2 prior instances of embezzlement from prior employers. And so the company did its job. It hired a firm to do a background check, but that background check was inappropriately done. And it was that background check firm that ended up standing the bill for that fraud. And, so I think there's some things that we can do. I don't have a magic elixir that someone can drink and it will compel them to behave ethically. I'm not sure if I would even wish that I did. But I think setting expectations, providing boundaries, if you will, or bumpers, are things that can be done to strengthen preventive and detective controls and maybe head some of that off, at least for those that are, bothered by the deterrence factor.
And Kevin, let's focus on the word train there. I mean, you know what I do a little bit on the side where I'll teach the state-specific ethics for the state board. And I usually tell a story very early on that talks about, why do you study history? Well, you study history to understand the mistakes of the past so that you don't repeat them. I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I think that's part of why the state boards and probably companies that have an annual ethics review do that. It's to get you to think about stuff before it happens and remind you, here's a story of a CPA who got in trouble. Don't be that CPA.
An interesting anecdote, and it relates to CPAs in Tennessee. For the last 3 or 4 years, you have to have a certain amount of continuing professional education hours in order to maintain your license and renew it. And we do audits every year of roughly 10% of all licensees each year to actually audit and look at the CPE certificates that are behind their assertion that they have enough hours. And the last 3 or 4 years, we've had non-compliance rates of 20 to 40% that are resulting from our audits. So the board thought about that, and this past year, we implemented a requirement that basically said, you don't need to provide us with copies of your certificates, but you do need to provide us with a listing of the courses that you have taken and the categories of courses that you have taken with the submission of your license renewal. And that was done. Interestingly enough, we're now finding, preliminarily, our audit season isn't done, but we're now finding compliance that may be approaching upwards of 95%. So we've moved to a non-compliance rate of less than 5%. Well, part of that was the board making a decision to kind of create bumpers and to try to direct people down the right lane.
Here's another question. With debt refinancing and covenant waivers becoming the norm among clients impacted by COVID-19, how does that alter audit procedures for year end? Do you see companies having discussion over audit fees as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think with respect to that, let's take the last question, part of that question first. I think there will be discussions about fees just because procedures are going to change. The way that audits are being performed is going to change. There will be more subsequent events. There's more likelihood, I think, if the economic recession continues to take hold and deepen, of bankruptcies, going concern situations, which generally typically create higher risk and require more of a robust audit response. And so I could see, that engendering more or greater fees in some cases. So I think you have that part in play because the scope of the work is clearly going to change. And then I think, Perry, the first part of the question is, I think, had to do with debt covenants and waivers becoming the norm. How does that alter audit procedures? It seems to me that the procedures around going concern are going to be most likely affected in those areas. And we have guidance from both now Fasb Gaap and PCAOB or ASB GAS around going concern. There's a lot of overlap there. The PCAOB, as I understand it, is considering getting into the game with its own standard setting process on going concern. And so I think that's going to be affected. I mean, if you can complete your debt refinancing and increase your runway, that's one way to support the contention that you are a viable going concern. On the other hand, if you're unable to do that and it's beyond your control and you're at the mercy of creditors, chances are you're going to have a modification relating to going concern. And covenant waivers, that's going to be clear. The other issue that's coming out is COVID-19 liability, from an employer perspective or from a customer public perspective. Should companies be accruing general liabilities for prospective COVID-19 related claims that haven't even been filed yet? We have existing literature and guidance that indicates, what you would record as a liability and when in a litigation type of a circumstance. That's going to be another whole issue, I think, that's going to be looming in the next 2 or 3 years as well, because I mean, I think we've all seen the attorney advertisements on TV. They're out there, trying to get a buck too, for better or worse. And I think that's also going to be an audit issue as time goes on, increasingly so.
Well, I mean, covenants are always something an auditor works on. I know when I did an internship in 1996 with Arthur Anderson, they did a great job of dividing me up over 12 weeks to do something different every week. And one of those weeks was really focusing just on covenants and following up and getting into the documentation because it's critical.
Yeah. And
you look at what Alabama and all these big time football programs are doing. Before a player can walk in the door, they're signing a waiver.
Yeah.
That if I get sick, I can't sue you.
Yeah.
But yet, if I don't sign it, I can't play.
Yeah, it's people are going to have to make some tough choices, and in terms of, it's the same type of choice that we talk about in our session today, remote work environment. Well, at some point, it will become less remote. I don't know when that will be, but there will be probably a fair amount of trepidation for people as they go back into a more contained office building environment. What are the safeguards? What are we going to do about that? I have diabetes. What's that going to mean for me? And, we don't know what the answers to those are going to be, but I think we felt, at least broadly, that this topic was a good one for discussion. And it looks like the questions that the participants have been asking have just been straight on and very relevant.
And just to scare people to be vigilant. This came from a student Monday night. Family runs an engineering company, had their first run-in with fraud, which is kind of surprising, been around a long time. Apparently they did some work for a local school system and they were entitled to a percentage of completion check of $120,000. They billed the client, said that the check had been mailed. They said, a month later, we don't have the check. Client said, well, we mailed the check and it's been deposited. So he said, well, we don't have the money. So somehow the check ended up in California, deposited into a bank account that had nothing to do with the business, and it was mobile deposited. $120,000 check, mobile deposited. So then he says, don't banks have controls over the size of checks you can deposit mobily? Maybe. So more, it's not their fraud as much, it's the person that was paying them because their check was diverted. But it's still interesting. Just be vigilant. Don't click on that link from someone you don't know. Don't answer the phone. If you think about what happened last week with Twitter, that happened because they got to some low-level employees and then got access into the Twitter network, and then they could make changes to famous people's accounts. And $120,000 was moved through Bitcoin. So I've got about 1 till. So Kevin, Suzanne approached me and I said, I can't do this without Kevin. So thank you for coming on. Davis, we
Glad
thank
to.
you for your help today. And don't hesitate to reach out to us. I mean, I think most people on the call have my email, but if you want to get to Kevin, send me something and I'll forward it on to Kevin as well.
Glad to follow up with anybody who would like to, Perry, and especially glad to join you today.
Appreciate it. Y'all have a good rest of the day.